and we're live. It's Caroline Stevens, Seeking the Truth. We're live on YouTube this afternoon and in our East Midlands studio. Got the pleasure of introducing you to John Brindley.
Good afternoon.
John, would you like to explain who you are briefly? Because I know some people at home will have met you before on our previous show quite some while ago.
Okay. Well, I'm a journalist, both sort of from the mainstream, probably more in the past, and alternative media in the present. In that I worked for local newspapers during most of my career, but now I've branched out and I work for David Icke on davidicke.com. So I'm a staff writer on his website, and that reflects my interests these days. In that I'm seeking, as you are, the truth about a lot of issues that in the past I maybe wrote about, but was merely just repeating the mainstream views.
So on today's program, we're going to be talking about the Beatles. Now,
Yes.
This is before my time, John.
Very good.
Yes,
And true, of course.
it is. It was a few years, just a few years. Anyway, so you brought this book, The Memoirs of Billy Shears, and is this picture something to do with Sergeant Pepper?
It is to do with Sergeant Pepper, and it's to do with obviously Paul McCartney himself. The Memoirs of Billy Shears is a brilliant book.
You're not getting paid commission on this.
I'm absolutely not getting paid commission on it. When I say it's a brilliant book, it's because it both says something very, very important and disclaims it at the same time. And the reason for that is that the information that's in there, we are not legally allowed to know. There are contracts in existence, I believe.
Like copyright contracts?
Well, personal disclaimer, personal documents which influential people have signed, which say that in our lifetime we're not allowed to disclose basically the information that's in there.
Right. So it's something similar to, is it something similar to Diana's death where they kept the papers closed? Well, in her case, it's for 100 years.
Yeah. In this case, I believe this information must not be made explicit to the general public until at least the death, the transition of the actor who is in place as Paul McCartney.
Right, so we're focusing on one of the members, Paul McCartney, who many will know married Linda McCartney.
Yeah.
And then married Heather Mills.
Yeah.
And we're saying that's not the real Paul McCartney from the original Beatles, do we think?
Yeah, and of course I recognise it's a large jump for anyone to believe that, and to put it into context. Until I was just I do admit that I remember the Beatles, by the way, and I was just an average interest in them, and as you know, not basically a Beatles fan. But until probably say 3 to 4 years ago, I had no interest or knowledge of this whatsoever. And then one day I was at my laptop, and flashing across the laptop came a message: Paul McCartney died in 1966. And that was not a blinding flash of revelation for me. It just made me laugh. And I thought, well, I've never known anything so outrageous as that.
Where did this message come from?
It was obviously just a flash advert of a video, probably. I mean, I was looking for something in an associated subject, and that came up, and I never looked at this anymore. I just sort of, that's completely crazy. But then sometimes these subjects that come, fairly randomly, then refuse to go away. They refuse to go away, and what happened then again? Sort of just purely by chance. A couple of years ago, I was on YouTube and I saw another video, and I decided on this occasion I was going to look at it and see what this person was saying. and it was a gentleman from Liverpool who was in his 50s, a very sort of down to earth, working class sort of type of guy, regular type of guy, who was claiming to be Paul McCartney's son. And what his claim was, as I watched the video, was that he was the son of the original Paul, who then died in 1966, and that he is not the son of the person who the public, the world believes is Paul McCartney today. So he then obviously elaborated this story, and in a nutshell, the story was that his mother and his father, who turned out to be his stepfather, brought this young man up in Liverpool. And I think, so some people could possibly relate to this, that he felt in himself, in his spirit, that his father was not actually his father. There was something that didn't quite fit in the way that he was brought up. And he asked his mother this. He broached the subject with her. Must have been an incredibly brave thing to do,
Yeah.
mustn't it? And his mother said, I will tell you the truth, which was a good reassuring thing. And she said that she worked in Liverpool, worked in an office which was next to the recording studios where the Beatles, where Beatles produced their music, and that an increasing number of lunchtimes, this rather sort of dashing sort of young Beatle called Paul McCartney would come across and talk to her, and obviously, had a fancy for her. And she said that at first she was not having any of this. She thought he was a bit flash and probably interested in hundreds of different girls and things like that. She turned out to be true, in fact. But she did fall for him, and she did become his girlfriend. And then subsequently, this young man was born as their son. And he then said, yes, but how could this possibly be true? Because I don't believe my father's alive anymore. And you're telling me you're telling me that my father's Paul McCartney. And she said, Paul died in 1966 in a car crash. And then he said, or his reaction to that was that all the pieces, these sort of figments of an idea and dots about how his life was, how his life was formed and who he really was, suddenly put into place. And for him, that story was entirely the correct story. He then went on to talk about having several visits, but not just him having visits, but the family home having visits from the Beatles. He certainly mentioned John Lennon, George, Ringo, a management figure, and also a relative of Paul. And the reason for this visit was mostly to speak to the mother rather than this guy, the son, and to tell them, look, we know that there's been stories circulating, gossip going around the schools of Liverpool and in the city as a whole, talking about Paul, and this has just got to stop.
So they were warned off.
Yeah, they were warned off because they did not want this story to sort of escalate beyond the city.
So the Beatles were very popular then.
Well, obviously, yeah,
at that particular time.
incredibly popular. Yeah. And so the mother apparently said, "Well, how can you do that? How can you live on, live in this complete and utter lie when knowing that Paul, the real Paul is dead, having somebody in his place and expect to get away with it?"
Did they look similar?
We'll get on to that in a minute. So there's similar and similar, isn't there? There's similar and identical. Similar, yes. Identical, not. But the answer that was given to the mother, as to that question, as how can you get away with it, was given apparently by John Lennon himself, who said, we have got away with it, and what we need to do now is just let it be. That rings a bell with a song, doesn't it? And a lot of their songs and their lyrics are incredibly ironical. So they wanted this issue, not speaking about anymore. And interestingly enough, and I'm saying no more about it because I don't think he actually came to any conclusion particularly about it either, that this young lady actually died of cancer not a few years later. Now, I'm saying no more about that. But he obviously, in later life, we're talking about quite a few years on from that incident and the death of his mother, is still irked about everything and believes fully that he is the son of James Paul McCartney, the original Paul McCartney, and wanted to tell the world that. Interestingly enough, you'll not find that video anymore. It was removed from YouTube.
Well, I mean, that's the beauty of the internet, isn't it? It's so easy for censorship to happen.
Yeah.
And we were just fair earlier about the fact that music had changed. The Beatles' music actually changed from being of one type of nature, sweet-natured.
Yeah, very much so. I mean, if there are many divides from pre-1966 and then after that. The first few years of the Beatles, I think, were characterised, and these aren't my words. These words are in that book, by the word silly love songs. Maybe silly is a bit harsh. Maybe harmless might have been a better phrase. But we were talking about sort of nice songs that made people quite happy and optimistic and got people on the wavelength of the Beatles. And I believe all the time that wavelength was being manipulated by other forces to make them even more successful and even more attracted to by the general public. I mean, in particular, young girls, because we've got to remember that the adoration and the craziness of the general public and the particular young females towards the Beatles was virtually unprecedented. And we're talking about mass hysteria, aren't we?
Yeah.
Which, these boys were like clean cut. The music was good.
Well, that was the image.
Yeah, their appearance was good, but it still doesn't explain totally how they jettisoned from virtual obscurity during the first few years and changes in the band and this type of thing, and not knowing whether they were ever going to really make it, to suddenly becoming like the number one band in the world. And not only sort of being so utterly omnipotent in Britain, but going to America and taking America basically by storm. And interestingly enough, that happened just before, I believe, this incident with Paul. And there was never, from that point onwards, the Beatles not only changed their music, but they changed their modus operandi totally. And from a touring group, became basically session musician. In the recording studio, they played very few, if any, live concerts after that particular incident. And why would that be the case? They were at the absolute top of their fame. You see within the music industry, you see iconic groups and iconic. I'm not using that in the way the world looks at it really, but superstars who seemingly they can't get enough of touring. Elton John's finishing in his career with a 2-year world tour at the age of 71. You've got endless people who will never retire, and yet somehow this group really, to all intents and purposes, went to ground apart from its recording mode. And certainly the songs changed we started with that, didn't we?
Yeah.
With Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, the album, the whole album cover is extremely significant. Um, I think if we can, most of us can probably remember a fair bit about it. There's endless sort of famous people on that cover, aren't there? There's a wreath in the middle, which with the title "The Beatles" on there, and I believe that the reason for that was that the Beatles are just as we know it, as we knew them, gone. The Beatles had died from that point onwards. A new band was created, if you like. Um, Paul was walking across a crossing with bare feet, and that is again symbolic of the fact that he's no longer actually physically alive
with us.
Yeah. Now,
and you do believe he died?
I do believe he died. Yeah.
So Heather Mills, the rumor is that
Yeah.
Heather Mills knew
what?
Knew that Paul McCartney wasn't the real Paul McCartney.
Right. Yes and no. I mean, yes, to all intents and purposes, towards the end. But I think there's a complete contrast here between Linda McCartney and Heather Mills. Linda Eastman, I think it was originally, was a society photographer who knew the music industry, and it is said in sort of in that book, I believe, that when she met Paul McCartney, or Paul McCartney too, one of her phrases towards him was, "I know who you are, and I know who you aren't."
Linda Eastman said that.
That said that to Paul, and
but
so
Eastman, she would be part of the elites, would she not?
Well, yeah. So in other words, Paul had if you like, a divine meeting with someone, a soul connection with a woman who not only did they get on incredibly well together and were, a great partnership in every respect, but she knew the big secret from the beginning that he was carrying, and so therefore she went into that relationship on a level ground, and he knew that there was no need for him to to have reservations or to do anything to try to ensure that
the apple cart wasn't going to be spilled. Well, on that note, I think we need to go on to a part 2 session. So, John, can you stay for part 2?
Well, I could be tempted, yeah.
Thank you, and thanks to everybody at home for watching and listening. I see we have gone live on YouTube. We didn't manage to do Facebook this afternoon, but we'll see you in part 2. Stay tuned. Bye for now.
So we didn't answer about how similar they were. Obviously it's absolutely vital thing.